So this is a distinctive argument, which is not about, I've been arguing in terms of what are our obligations being affluent and given the possibility that we can assist the people in extreme poverty, what are our obligations to do so? I haven't talked about rights or rights violations, and some people may think that that's a more promising approach to this issue and wonder why not. So here I'm exploring that particular approach. And when you can do that, you can start with this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, obviously an extremely well-known international document, perhaps the best known international document relating to rights, dating back from the period immediately after the Second World War. Set up a number of rights, and in connection with discussion of global poverty, it's Article 25, Section 1 that really sets out the claim that there are these rights that are universal, that everybody has, and they include a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of oneself, one's family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, necessary social security services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. So this is extremely sweeping, and a lot of people have said, well, if you're going to say that's a human right, then where does that come from, and who is supposed to be violating it? If, as obviously is the case, a lot of people in the world don't have this. They don't have this adequate standard of living. They certainly don't have security in the event of unemployment or sickness or disability. These are things which really only people in affluent countries have. And so how can we claim, who is supposed to be providing these rights to people? And that leads people to say, look, we ought to make an important distinction when we talk about rights between positive and negative rights. And this right to food and adequate standard of living and healthcare and so on, they're positive rights, and they're different because it's not obvious who violates them. So you can take a negative right, like the right to free speech. If you write an article criticising the government and you live in a country where the government is likely to arrest you and lock you up for doing that, then it's perfectly clear who has violated your rights. In this particular case, the government has violated your right to free speech by locking you up because you wrote something critical of the government. And individuals, not the government, could violate your rights to free speech too. And in fact, it's happened to me on a couple of occasions when I've tried to give a lecture, not recently, but about 20 years back in Germany in particular, because my views on euthanasia were regarded as very provocative, and there were groups of people who tried to prevent me speaking, and actually, in fact, succeeded on a couple of occasions by blocking the doors of lecture theatres or coming armed with whistles so that I couldn't be heard. So I would say they were, those specific people who did that, who organised that, were violating my rights to free speech. But it's much harder to say who is violating a positive right if you don't have a right, if you don't have enough to eat, as happens in many poor countries. It could be, of course, that you actually grew enough food for yourself, and somebody, again, it could be the government, or it could be somebody else, could be a roving band of militia, perhaps, if you're in a country without that kind of law and order, took your harvest from you. So, okay, then it's pretty clear that they've violated your rights to food, but we might say simply they violated your rights to property. This was your property and they took it from you. But that's a special case. If, in fact, the rain's failed and you're hungry because, although you planted your crop, it shriveled and died in the heat, and therefore you have no food, then it's much less clear who might have violated your right or how that could have been done. So that's a distinction between positive and negative rights, and a lot of people say we ought not to violate people's negative rights. They have rights to whatever it might be, to life, various liberties and so on, and you can tell who violates them. But positive rights are different, and some people would say, in fact, they're more kind of rhetoric or aspirational about things that we would like to see, rather than things that we regard as rights violations. And that goes along with a general argument of a libertarian kind, of which I've given you one example here by a Canadian philosopher called Jan Narveson. So libertarians typically believe that nobody should violate our rights in the sense of those negative rights, and that includes rights to our property, but we don't really have positive rights. And here's a statement by Narveson to that effect. He says, "I'll take it as given that we're certainly responsible for evils we inflict on others, no matter where, and that we owe these people compensation. Nevertheless, I've seen no plausible argument that we owe something as a matter of general duty to those to whom we've done nothing wrong." So in other words, he would be saying, if there are people who are starving because their crops have failed, or just they have very little land and they can't grow enough, the soil is poor, then Narveson's saying, I've seen no plausible argument that says we owe something as a matter of general duty to them because we've done nothing wrong to them. We have not inflicted an evil upon them, is the kind of thing he's saying. Perhaps we've had no contact with them at all, in fact. So if we had no contact with them, then Narveson would say, how can we have done something wrong with them? How could I have done something wrong to a person in a poor country who I've actually had no contact with at all? So here's Pogge's response to this. He wants to have a notion of what it is to violate a human right that is sensitive to this criticism that I can't be blamed because the rain's failed and somebody is hungry in, let's say, Mali. So he says, yeah, okay, a human rights violation is not like that. It's not, his example is perhaps even more bizarre, the destruction of a town by a meteorite, or even culpable failures to give enough aid or enough protection. So he would say the kind of things that I've been talking about and saying we ought to, if we're affluent, we ought to assist people in global poverty. He would say, well, yes, you know, he doesn't disagree with that. I've had discussions with him. We've been on the same platform at conferences discussing global poverty, and his view of the argument that I've presented to you is, yeah, I think that's a good argument, but it's not the only argument. I have a different argument which is additional to your argument, to the argument that I've presented. And that argument is that we are violating the rights of the poor. And he says here this narrower view, this is from the article that's in your essential reading, human rights violations are crimes actively committed by particular human agents who should be identified and then be persuaded to change their ways or else stopped. So he's sensitive to this criticism that somehow or other there has to be some connection between what some human beings are doing that violates the rights of the poor. So the question then is, well, what could this be if we're talking about global poverty, given the distances and the apparent lack of interaction between us and them? And he draws a distinction here between two kinds of human rights violations. He says a neglected distinction often. Interactional ones are the ones that I've been talking about that we would most naturally think of. So, for example, if I'm part of a militia that rampages through the country, seizing the crops of peasants, then obviously that's an interactional situation. I've done things to others that I intend in this case to deprive them of their human rights, or certainly I foresee that having taken their property they'll be hungry, and there are a variety of other things like that. But he says we should also not forget that there could be institutional human rights violations. We could have designed, or we could be imposing institutional arrangements that we intend, although in fact he's going to focus more on foresee or should foresee, will avoidably deprive them of their human rights. So he says we should look at the institutional arrangements that we have set up and that do these things.